We are back, and we are joined now by Julie Su, who served as acting U.S. Labor Secretary in the Biden administration and is currently a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. Her latest piece in the American Prospect is entitled Union Buster in Chief. Julie, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you. It's so good to be here with you.
So good for you to be with us. This is an important conversation because prior to the election, there was a lot of branding by the Republicans and their efforts to make it seem like they could be pro-worker in at least aesthetic. And there's this talk about right-wing populism. You don't really see that reflected in their labor policies, do you?
I mean, you see the exact opposite, right? Which I suppose is not surprising, given that everything they've said is, they're doing something different to hurt every sector of our communities. But on workers, it's so clear that they've launched a full-on war on workers. And in many ways, the federal government employees have had to, sort of borne the brunt of that, because this president has both sort of modeled the worst kind of behaviors of an employer and then said to everyone across the country, this is the way that we're allowed to treat people. And it's been the exact opposite of a pro-worker administration.
You mentioned there his targeting of federal workers, and early on in your piece in the American Prospect, you draw a comparison to Ronald Reagan firing the striking air traffic controllers during his administration. Can you speak about that parallel and why it's so troubling that Trump seems to be expanding upon it?
Yeah. So in 1981, right, Ronald Reagan basically replaced striking air traffic control workers and essentially gut the union and sent a very clear message to those workers that they were fully expendable. And this not only was a massive attack on those workers' rights, it also really catalyzed decades of union busting activity by private sector employers too. And so for many of us who care about workers' rights, that's been an example of how government abuse of power can really undermine workers and worker organizing in dramatic ways. The contrast to that is what President Biden did, which was recognize that what presidents say matters, what the federal government does matters, and be very explicitly pro-union and pro-worker. And we saw the effect of that too, right? Federal government unions grew dramatically under the Biden administration. And so I draw the parallel because Donald Trump has taken that 1980s playbook and completely radicalized it, modernized it for his particular brand of war on workers. And at every single turn, he has ripped up union contracts. He's closed down entire agencies. He has cut, anywhere he can, he has found a way to pull the rug out from under working people. And it is going to be devastating for decades to come in all kinds of ways unless we put a stop to it now.
Is the precedent of targeting a public sector union is important to understanding this dynamic here? Because I mean, I guess that's immediately under, his direct control and the umbrella of, the federal government. So that's the first place I guess you would start. But I wonder what that means even more than just it's his war on the federal workforce.
That's right. So the problem here with everything that's happening is that it's both Donald Trump and the federal government as employer, right? And the federal government is much more highly unionized than the private sector. The private sector is just around 10%, and the federal government is over 30. And so it has long been a place where people trade in, much higher paying jobs for public service and for the good things that come with a union job, right? Security, decent wages, benefits, a good retirement, things that everybody should have but are not required by law. You get them because you have a union. And so the attacks are both an employer saying that I'm just unilaterally not going to respect that contract, long-standing contracts in this situation, but also the President of the United States saying it's open season on workers and on unions in workplaces. And we've already started to see that, right? The ways that this president has eliminated the ability of, it's really hard to join a union in this country. It's really, really hard once you want one to actually get one. There's a lot of hurdles you have to get through. And when you eliminate the institutions that are in place to help make that happen, it just becomes harder and harder for workers to get what they're legally entitled to and what they want. And the president's latest actions are another way of sending a clear message that you are not entitled to a union, you're not entitled to organize, you're not going to get those kinds of protections.
Can you take us through the firings of this administration and the Doge attacks? It was around 150,000 workers who were fired under Doge. They were utilizing loopholes about protections, or lack of protections rather, for probationary employees to achieve that. But he's now stripped 400,000 federal workers of union protection. So this is a dramatic escalation. If you just don't mind laying out the timeline of this assault.
So let's be very clear that this administration from day one has been built on hypocrisy about, we're going to care about workers, but we're going to do everything we can to undermine our own workers' rights. So from the very beginning, it was about insulting them, saying that they're not really working, right? Calling them the deep state. It's all these things that setting the groundwork for being able to do whatever you can. And let's also be clear that these actions are actually not legal, right? There's no backstop at this point to this administration's activities. Now, there have been lawsuits filed, and those have helped us slow the attacks. But what we see is a constant, as you put it, escalation. So from the very beginning, it was undermining and discrediting federal employees. And then it was a whole battery of firing probationary employees en masse. Now, again, those actions have been slowed, but it has not stopped this administration, because the other thing you can do if you're a bad employer is just make work so miserable that people are put in a really terrible position, having to decide to stay because they care about the mission, stay because they want to do their jobs, and leave because the job has become untenable. And that is something else that the president has done. So giving these ridiculous asinine assignments, essentially tearing away the mission of organizations. Again, on a daily basis, all kinds of seemingly small ways of making work miserable. So, you walk away from your desk and you don't know if you're going to get escorted out the building, right? There's all kinds of stories of the misery that workers have had to put up with. And so then many of them ended up leaving, basically being forced out because they could no longer do their jobs in a way that was consistent with their mission, right? Being told that your job is the exact opposite of what you're supposed to be doing, right? Instead of enforcing labor laws, you're supposed to be helping to round up immigrants, for example. It makes the jobs untenable. And now this latest move of just saying we're not going to respect the unions at all is a way of telling their workers that they're alone, right? There's no one to protect them. They're basically at-will employees now. They can be fired for anything. And that the unions themselves will be weakened by not having enough members, which takes away one of the most important things that have always stood against autocracies and dictators, right, which are unions fighting against their abuse of power.
You mentioned this is illegal. How is it legal for the president to unilaterally tear up, it's a collective bargaining agreement?
Exactly. I mean, it's not legal. The problem is that the courts have proven to be an inadequate check on power, even though there are victories that take place at certain stages, right? The president has been very clear. He's not going to comply with what courts say. And so that's part of the problem, right? When you have a person in power who is enabled by others who, ratify and magnify the lies and the abuse, and then you don't have a backstop, you really have a lawless situation. And so the actions are not legal. Now, challenging them in court is an important step, but it's really not enough. And I think where the real power comes from is where it's always come from, which is working people who are willing to say no, not on my watch. And all of us need to support the efforts of those workers who are having to draw on courage that they never knew that they would have to use.
Is it your opinion that this unprecedented attack on what should be a legally protected collective bargaining agreement is a canary in the coal mine for this to spread into the private sector? Because this is something we can also touch on. Trump has gutted the National Labor Relations Board and they can't reach quorums. So if this goes on longer, this means that basically any deliberations about unionization are frozen.
That's right. I think what's clear is that all of the rules that we've been relying on to protect workers, protect the right to organize, as inadequate as those rules were to date, all of that is, it's a whole new world in which none of those rules matter. And so, again, the analogy to Reagan is apt because when Ronald Reagan did that, it really opened up I call it open season because it really was a declaration of war on workers and on unions that private sector employers picked up their weapons and continued to fight. And that resulted in a large decline in unionization, right? It really, we see the effects of it today. And so this president is doing it again, but with absolutely no holds barred. And so, taking away the institutions that protect workers' rights to organize, but also the message, right? There's all kinds of ways that employers bust unions, but hide it under the guise of they were fired for different reasons. We actually had to make cuts there because it was a cost-cutting effort. It wasn't about busting the union. All kinds of things are perfectly legal, like captive audience meetings that actually end up targeting union organizers and hurting workers. You asked me, about what the difference is in leadership. When Joe Biden was in office, he not only made very clear to workers who were organizing that the right to form or choose a union is yours and yours alone, right? We had the strongest agencies across the federal government protecting workers' rights to organize, enforcing labor laws, enforcing against wage theft and health and safety violations, all part and parcel of making workers vulnerable, right? When you don't have those things in place. And ensuring that workers got fair contracts. Now, all of that has been reversed. And so I think, the rules, there are no rules anymore for that protect workers from the federal government's perspective.
And the federal government here, just if I could ask you to expand on the status of the National Labor Relations Board and the firing of Glenn Wilcox. Where are we at there? And are you already hearing reports of this having chilling effects on unionization efforts? I mean, there's important stuff right now happening down in the South. The UAW is leading drives down there to get these southern states that have very disadvantageous environments to unionize in. They're trying to get over that hump. But my fear is, of course, there's no board to hear some of these these disputes that are definitely going to come. And as we know, it's completely disproportionate when the employer has all these resources and the union doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, Donald Trump has basically unilaterally rescinded the NLRA by not having a quorum on the National Labor Relations Board, right? So he fired Gwen Wilcox. A court initially said that she should be reinstated, and now that has been put on hold. So she's also fighting her legal battle. The other problem, of course, we need to fight in the courts, but those battles take a long time, and they're not adequate for the urgency of the moment that we have. So there's no quorum at the NLRB, which means that when there are unfair labor practices that are brought forward, the board really cannot act. And that is, to your point, there are difficult organizing drives being taken on by incredible unions with incredible leadership, right? Going into some of the hardest places to organize and saying these workers deserve better. And that, when those workers want to say, we get a say in our wages, we should be able to come home healthy and safe at the end of the day. We should have benefits like union workers across the rest of the country, that those workers are unable to get an election, right? To have the unfair labor practices heard. And that's also extremely devastating. The other thing, just kind of connecting all the threads of a president who will declare open season on his own workers and its impact on the private sector, is we've already seen that sometimes when workers win their initial right to have a union, that private employers are using the lack of an NLRB to not negotiate a first contract, right? They're saying there is no NLRB. That's absurd. There's completely no bar to that, right? Negotiating in good faith is the employer's obligation. But to your point, the fact that all of these laws and rules and bodies that are supposed to protect workers are being systematically dismantled is allowing employers who would bust their unions to do so, to use that as an excuse to do so.
Are there what is the recourse in the courts outside of the National Relations Board? Is there, I'm ignorant about like the statute here, if you don't mind explaining.
Well, right. So, in a little bit, this is kind of untested, right? Because the NLRB is the board that's supposed to hear unfair labor practice claims. And now, without one, it's it is sort of this wild, wild west of exactly what are workers entitled to, especially because if you go, the reason why the NLRB exists is that you have real experts there who understand the National Labor Relations Act, right? Who understand what an unfair labor practice is, who can adjudicate those claims in a more expedited manner. When you rip that away, you really leave workers with very little recourse. So workers are finding their way, right? They're testing, going to court. There's states are trying to step into the breach, right? So states like California and Massachusetts have proposals before them that would say, in the absence of a federal National Labor Relations Act, we should be able to protect the right to organize, right? Normally that's covered entirely by federal law. And so I think there are people who are stepping into the breach and trying to do creative things. But the reality is that it is really dismantling a decades-long system that has not been enough, but has been one way that it's been a really important way that workers have been able to exercise their right to join a union. And this is the fact that it's being dismantled by a president who said that he was going to stand for workers is truly outrageous.
Well, no taxes on tips is what I guess basically comes out of that, which is just obviously says nothing about, the right to organize. That I guess brings me to expanding our conversation slightly, because we're in the middle, I think, of a really turbulent time in our economy, and the Biden administration was plagued by accusations of inflation, when we know that in part greedflation was driving much of this, with corporations having record profits but prices still being high after the naturally occurring bottlenecks from COVID. They extended that and capitalized on it and took home record profits, and that persists through the Trump administration. But the other piece in our economy that I don't think is getting talked about enough is the underemployment crisis of folks who are working multiple jobs at very low wages, including the burgeoning gig economy, which is reliant on many of these workers to be profitable, and they functionally have very little protections. As someone who works in the administration and worked on a lot of these matters, what is your perspective on what that means for workers' rights in the economy if these kinds of jobs continue to be some of the only things that are available to folks?
Yeah, great. So just to break that down for one moment, right? Part of the answer to that is that we recently saw in the latest jobs report that job growth is slowing under this president's chaotic and damaging economic policies. So you have slowing growth. That means fewer job opportunities for people who are looking. Unemployment is going up. That's real life suffering for people who are just trying to make a decent living. Then you have what you said, which is this growing gigification of the economy, and the century's worth of labor protections, including the minimum wage, overtime, and the right to unionize, attached to workers who are employees, right? You get those protections if you are an employee. If you're not, you don't. And so there's been this also decades-long effort to undermine worker protections by calling your employees something else, calling them an independent contractor, calling them a gig worker, right, and then saying they're not entitled to rights. And so that's been damaging for organizing, right? Workers have a harder time organizing if they're nominally cut out from the National Labor Relations Act. It also means that workers don't feel like they have rights, right? They feel like they're not entitled to overtime because they're not called an employee. And to your point, this has resulted in a whole sector of really of insecure work, right? Of working people who are working full-time year-round but cannot afford the basics, who cannot get by, who cannot build toward a more secure life. And so those are also choices that corporations have made, that industries have created, that have really sort of weakened labor law protections, but also been big contributors to poverty, wages, and poor working conditions.
And for my in my analysis of it, this was only made possible really in a bipartisan manner in over the course of, I don't know, 30 years, where the focus on consumer prices being low was always kind of the driver of economic policy, really across administrations for a while. Now we have Trump, who is obsessed with tariffs and wants to actively raise prices. It's not quite clear if he even understands what he's doing, which is a great sign for us. But just what was encouraging about your work in the administration was that it was yours and Jonathan Cantor's, Lena Khan, et cetera. Like, it was a departure from some of that consumer focus. Can you zoom out and talk about that dynamic a bit? And if you feel that there's a growing kind of like intellectual community on your guys' side of things that is going to be more Keynesian, maybe?
Yeah, we understood and understand that consumers and workers are the same people, and that when we talk about how the prices of things are too high and the need to address affordability, of course that's true. That is 100% right. But the price of things is only one half of that equation. The other part is what people make, right? The other part is how good your wages are, how much you have in your pocket at the end of a workday in order to afford the necessities of life. And the more you undercut workers, the more you undercut enforcement and allow wage theft to run rampant, the less people feel secure, the less people can afford also, because their jobs just aren't enough for them to get by anymore. And that is something that we fought against in the Biden administration. We fought against it by increasing enforcement. We fought by doing everything we could in the executive's power to increase wages, right, including the wages of federal government contractors, and to fight monopolies that engage in the kind of behavior that's harmful to both workers and to consumers. And so both sides of that equation really matter, and that's why the attacks on workers are ultimately also attacks on, right, a whole, a vision of an economy in which everyday people can actually have some say, right? Can have some ability to make choices about their lives, and a good job is really fundamental to that.
Yeah, very much so. Lastly, you mentioned wage theft. For all the talk about crime running rampant all across the country, very little discussion about the number one form of theft in this country, which is wage theft. Can you give our audience a sense of, first, your work on this in the administration, and secondly, also the scale of this level of theft and how pervasive this problem is in the U.S.?
Yeah. So wage theft is essentially stealing wages out of workers' pockets. And it's 100% right what you said, that there's all this talk about crime that is intended to vilify certain communities, right? It's a focus on really a non-existent crime problem in order to create the ability for this administration to exercise a whole bunch of police power in horrific ways on communities. When the real crime, right, working people not getting what they're supposed to be paid, not getting a just day's pay for their day's work, is very real. And this administration has completely decided that they don't care about that they're going to come down on the side of the billionaire corporations who have essentially driven a lot of the practices we just talked about, right? Driven the gigification, driven the subcontracting, driven the things that have torn away labor protections, wage and hour protections for workers. There is a response that the federal government can give to that, and that is to enforce the labor laws. But this administration has also cut the Department of Labor by 20%. Nice. And so, the whole thing about, no tax on overtime, no tax on tips, those things don't help anybody if people don't have a job to begin with, if they're not getting paid overtime, right? Which this administration has also refused to adopt our expansion of overtime pay to workers. And so we are in a situation now where, for working people, it's really dire. The upside is that working people see it, right? I've always said this, that in government or anywhere else, people say, well, workers are too vulnerable to do this thing, right? Workers are too scared to organize, to stand up, to fight back. In my experience, working people have always been more willing to fight than those of us in positions of power. It's not been their fear that's held everybody back. It's been our own, and that's definitely, this is why it's a moment for us to lean into the strength and the courage of workers who are organizing against really great odds, who are standing up against a horrific attack on their rights and their livelihoods, including, to go back to the beginning, right, federal employees, right, but well beyond that, and recognize that, call out this administration for the pure hypocrisy of what they're doing to working people.
Well, Julie Su, I really appreciate your time. Julie served as acting U.S. Labor Secretary under the Biden administration, currently a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. You can also read her latest piece in the American Prospect entitled Union Buster in Chief. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.